Okay, so I decided for my talk to present some work that is hot off the press. We recently collected the data just as of a few weeks ago and are in the process of thinking of ways to analyze the data. So I would love to hear all of your thoughts either in the Q&A or in some of the breakout sessions. And this work is answering the sort of question of what is language, or more specifically words, doing to drive cognitive development, but as we will discuss, maybe development even more broadly than cognitive development. And when I give talks on vocabulary development, it is really not difficult to motivate how important this area of work is. Even non-scientists, such as parents and practitioners, can see that in the first few years of life, children's use and acquisition of words is so exciting, but also so important in the sense that it truly does appear to permeate every facet of their development and their life. And in science and language development, one way that we have historically characterized children's vocabulary development is through a checklist or standardized testing. And so here I'm giving you an example. This is the MCDI. There are different types, or there are different checklists depending on the age of the child. Generally speaking, what parents are asked to do is to check off the words that they've heard their child say out loud. And here, this is just the first page. There are hundreds of words on the CDI. And what we do is we analyze typically the numbers and types of words that children know. The key finding from this work in figuring out, okay, how does vocabulary relate to other domains of development, is that the number of words children produce in the first few years of life is very predictive of all kinds of outcomes. So cognitive skills, academic achievement, but even things longitudinally way down the road, such as social emotional functioning, occupational status, economic prosperity. The list goes on. This is very replicable and again provides sort of empirical evidence for what parents, practitioners, et cetera, see in children's day-to-day life, that there's something about vocabulary that is important for development, broadly speaking. So the big question is why? Why do we keep seeing the vocabulary sizes and predicting all of these long-term outcomes? And another way of asking the why question is, what is the mechanism? So what is vocabulary doing to permeate all these different domains of development? And for reasons that I won't go through in this talk for the sake of time, this is a really tricky question to tackle. And there's a group of us, me and Gary and some postdocs, Christina and Elise, working with us. We've had a lot of conversations about this big question. And I think the verdict was, well, we need to start somewhere. And where we've sort of dove into answering this question is by thinking about children's word meanings. So in other words, when they produce a word, what meaning do they intend to convey in producing that word? And I just want to give an example of how our prior methods, such as these checklists, are really glossing over this really important dimension of children's vocabulary. So for example, take the word forget. Forget is on a CDI checklist, so many 2-year-olds produce the word forget. What do children mean when they say forget? Well, they could mean, oh, I forgot where I put my my toy. They could use forget to mean, oh, I forgot the event. There's so many ways in which forget could be used. It could be a mental state, like, oh, mommy's brain's not working and she's forgetting. There's so many ways that just this one word on this checklist could get used. And of course, we'd expect to see developments in the word meanings. So forget is near and dear to my heart. It's one of the things that I study. And I believe that when I say the word forget, I have my own scientific meaning for the word that typically varies even from other adults who are not scientists, but certainly from children as well. Now, in this group, it's not hard to tell that the idea that word meanings likely reflect children's conceptual understanding of the world. And therefore, if we knew more about children's word meanings, we might be able to dig deeper and start to answer questions about vocabulary development, predicting life outcomes. So I will just say that there are alternative methods to checklists that have been used that provide support for this argument. So several researchers have conducted in-depth language diaries. One of my favorites is Kelly Mix followed a child very closely for the first few years of his life and found that his number words that were produced really reflected the child's number concepts. Other methods that have been used are sort of corpus transcripts of child-produced speech. And then, of course, there's been laboratory-based studies using experimental methods to determine what changes in words and word meanings might reflect in relation to conceptual understanding. Okay, again, in this group, probably not a hard sell on this, but there has been a lot of research that has backed this up in cognitive development. Okay, a limitation of this work is that a lot of this work has used small sample sizes, so certainly case studies, but even experimental studies, the N is small and thus doesn't afford broad generalizations about what is the nature of children's word meanings across large groups of children. And we see this issue even in aggregated data sets such as Childis. So for example, I went to Childis and I looked at the North American English section, and it only contains 30 instances of 2-year-olds producing the word forget. And when you look closely through the transcript, sometimes it's hard to infer which particular meaning of the word forget children were producing because certain contextual information is missing from the transcripts. So to start, we are starting with really big research questions, which is what are the nature of children's word meanings on a broader scale than a case study or laboratory study might be able to capture? And critically, does the quantity and quality of children's word meanings predict their vocabulary size? If so, this suggests that children's words meaning and how they reflect underlying conceptual structure may be able to start explaining why early vocabulary size predicts so many life outcomes. Okay, in this study, we surveyed parents of 1 to 3-year-old children, and they completed 3 surveys: a word meaning survey, which I'll show you an example of in just a second. That was with 35 words. They completed a protective vocabulary checklist, so checked off words that they heard their kids say out loud, similar to the CDI that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, and a demographic survey that also had some exploratory questions. Here's an example of one item from the word meaning survey. So parents were prompted to think about all the times that you've heard your child say forget, which meanings of forget is your child using, and then they check all that apply. And in each question, there were 3 examples given, and then there was sort of a, other where parents could add a meaning that isn't on the list, and then of course, parents could check off that they have not heard their child say that word yet. Okay, what I'm going to do is show you some of our preliminary analyses that I find really exciting because what they're revealing is a lot of variability in the meanings that children are using. So here are 3 words: forget, open, and up. And what you're seeing are the 3 meanings that parents were provided on the survey. And then on the far right column, the proportion of children producing a particular meaning. So for forget, we see that 2 words a significant proportion of children use, but the 3rd one on the list, so forget when referring to an event, we see that a smaller proportion of words are being used. And just another way to look at this, so this is just one way that we've looked at the variability, is just go through word to word and see the different word meanings. Another way to look at this is to say, okay, well, are these the same children or are they different children? And just to give you a quick snapshot for the word forget, we see that actually instead of, these all being the same child represented in that data, that we're actually seeing differences. So, 24% only referred to forgetting in the context of an object, 21% only in the form of an action. So in other words, it's not that there's a small group of children producing multiple meanings, but instead it appears that children are having one meaning that they're starting with, or at least according to their parental report. And we've tried to start thinking about how can we quantify this variability. And there are many different ways, and we love ideas. Here, I'm going to walk you through one way that we've conceptualized this. So what you're seeing on the x-axis are the mean number of deviations. And so what a deviation represents is, so they would receive a score of 0 if they produced only the most common meaning of a word. So just to go back here, if they only produced the first example on each of these, where the largest proportion of children produce this meaning, or they would get a 0 if they produced all 3. But I will just say that very few children produce all 3. So it typically represents that they just produce the most common meaning. And then they would receive a score of up to 2, depending on if they produced the more variable reason, or more. So let me go back here, the second and third examples. And this is just to capture the fact that we see a lot of variability. Again, this is more just a quantitative measure across all of the different words on the list of how much children are deviating from the most common meaning that is produced by children. And then finally, I know I'm over time, but the good news is I only have 2 slides left. We have also been conducting some models to try to answer the question, well, does this variability in word meaning have any predictive power for explaining vocabulary size? And we do have some evidence that the answer to that question is yes. So here you're seeing a linear model where we entered in several variables. So the first 2 are demographic, age, and parental education. And interestingly, parental education was not a predictor or significant predictor. Age, unsurprisingly, was. And then the third variable on this list is the number of meanings produced. And this is sort of a quantity check. So of course, the number of words kids say on the meaning measure should be predictive of the number of words they predict on the vocabulary checklist, because quantity should predict quantity. So you can think of this as a control or a sanity check. And yes, we see that that's a significant predictor. But here's the interesting part is there is unique variance predicted by the number of deviations. So the deviations is, again, this quantitative measure that we are working with in this previous screen. And we see that that's also a significant predictor, which suggests that of course the number of meanings produced is predictive of vocabulary size, but there's something about the quality or the diversity of meanings that children are using that is predicting vocabulary size. So I don't have concluding thoughts, I have interim thoughts because this is still ongoing and we're still analyzing the data. And I'd love to hear ideas and thoughts from everyone in the group as well.
Thanks, Haley. Do you mind just stopping the screen share so we can
yes.
see everyone? Great. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, I just before we go, so just a small clarification, the relationship with this number of deviation measure is positive. So kids who are following a less common pattern, so learning meanings that other kids don't have, but not learning necessarily the more common meanings, those kids tend to have a larger vocabulary. So sort of the more original, kids who are following a more original meaning learning trajectory have a higher vocabulary. Just kind of a counterintuitive result.
Is it more original or the more meanings you have what's the zero order correlation between number of meanings you have on average and your vocabulary and your age? Those are the two things I want to know.
Yeah, so they are significantly correlated, which we would expect because that's, again, like quantity and quantity, either, quantity of meetings or quantity of time you've been alive. And that's why in the model, we put those in to show that it's above and beyond just the quantity.
The number of meanings is a better predictor of vocabulary size. So the number of meanings of those just 30 words. But controlling for that, this deviation quantity is still predictive, although not hugely.
So one way of being diverse is to be wrong, like to think that forget means to never have known. Does your measure of diversity also show that that the children who are wrong in their meetings, who are discrepant compared to other children, are still on a good path to acquire large vocabularies?
So I think that's an excellent question. So in the survey that we gave to parents, we only asked what do they produce, not what do they produce correctly. So it could be that these kids are experimenting by producing more variable meanings, and they're wrong because they're experimenting, let's say. But it could also be that these kids just are producing the correct meaning. So we don't have good traction on that based on this data, but I do think that that's a really interesting way to get at this, is that there might be some kids who are producing the meaning just incorrectly. And that could be part of experimentation, but there might just be kids who have both good accuracy and a large number of meanings.
So let me try kind of an opposite possibility. This is so really interesting data. One of the things that I believe you see is the kids for relational nouns like uncle, kinship nouns, or even something like what Frank Kyle looked at, island, taxi, and so on. Mm-hmm. Instead of getting the relational meaning that a taxi is a car for hire, they say, this was a long time ago when Kyle did this, it's a yellow car. So they interpret a relational concept as though it was an object concept. And uncle is a guy in a chair with a pipe, or brother is a boy about 14 with freckles, and so on. So could it be the case that lots of kids have this sort of conservative, perceptually driven meanings for these words, and they'll use the word correctly, but in a very limited way. And then some of them also have the relational meaning, which would mean, for example, an island. That's another of Kyle's. It doesn't have to be a sandy place. So you might have a kid who can only recall these islands if they're sandy, and another kid who can use it much more broadly. Could that be part of it? That would more predict that variability is smart.
Yes, that's a great idea. And I think that certain words, when we do our next study, we're going to have a longer list of words. I think certain words lend themselves to examining that question. Our checklist only has 35 words, and some of them, I showed some, I will say some perhaps more interesting examples because there's multiple definitions, like some words like cat, there's potentially less diversity in. Now, what I think is interesting even about cat is there could be these idiosyncratic definitions or meanings that children have based on their life experience. And that's why we had that option for parents to report something that we didn't come up with. And unfortunately, few parents filled in that blank, and we don't know if that's because they're tired and that requires more work in a survey setting, or if they just didn't come to mind, or who knows why. But if we think of a way to tap those examples, I think it would be really another way to get at that question too.
Haley, would you consider, or maybe that's what you had in mind, the following flow of causality, or at least partial causality? from a large vocabulary that enables some input to work with, to some form of semantic organization, to the meaning diversity that you are observing, not the other way around, not from meaning diversity, or not independence of meaning diversity and vocabulary side.
Yes, so that's one of the reasons that this big question is so hard to answer, is that the causality can always go both ways, or at least it seems viably possible to go both ways. Yeah, I think that that's a possibility. I don't know if we can separate that here with this pilot data, but moving forward, I think that that will be another big question that we'll have to.
And we are, Vladimir, to your point, we do have word training studies. So on the assumption that knowing certain words and certain kinds of meanings, especially relational, these meanings with high inductive power, can drive further development, both linguistic and non-linguistic cognitive development. Training, exposing kids to those meanings is predicted to improve their performance on these kind of quote unquote non-linguistic tasks. We